This week in EDUC 140, we're going to take a look at cultural and linguistic diversity. Our language is both an integral part of and derived from our culture. The variations in a language within a culture can be as diverse as between cultures. Think about your own culture and where your language comes from. Are you a Native American English speaker, or do you speak another language in the home or with friends? Where did you grow up, and how did this influence your language? Even if you are a Native American English speaker, your language may be very different if you grew up in Los Angeles as opposed to Boston, Minnesota, or Nashville. Now think back to last week's lecture on sociocultural factors and the different roles we play in our lives. What are your roles? Man, woman, oldest sibling, middle child, youngest sibling, softball player, cello player, artist, computer whiz, comic genius. How have these roles and the people in these subcultures also shaped your language? When we think about all of the experiences, people, and places who have shaped our language, it is easier to see how our language is inextricably tied to our identity. Simultaneously, we use conventional language so we can communicate effectively, but also a language that is unique to who we are and how we experience the world. We communicate through a combination of both verbal and nonverbal expression. That is to say, it is not only important just what we say, but how we say it, along with the body language we use. Across cultures, both language and nonverbal expressions differ. For example, Bulgarians shake their head to mean yes and nod their head to mean no. Also, in some parts of the Philippines, quickly raising your eyebrows can mean hi, yes, or that you agree. In fact, experts estimate that vocal expression, or how the words are said, along with your facial and body expressions, account for about 93% of communication. This leaves only 7% of communication being accounted for by verbal expressions. I bet it makes a lot more sense as to why many conflicts arise via text, email, or forms of social media that eliminate 93% of effective communication. But what about when we are face-to-face, such as in a classroom or other educational context? What issues arise when there are linguistic and cultural differences? In the United States, we use verbal instruction to teach students new skills. Teachers are encouraged to have print-rich classrooms where students will have a plethora of opportunities to encounter language. Direct instruction, which entails using both explicit verbal instruction or lectures and demonstrations, is also emphasized. Yet when students come to school with a primary language other than the dominant language, it can be a difficult situation to negotiate. It was not long ago that some educators and linguists believed that students who did not use standard English lacked a valid language and were thus verbally deficient. Linguists who disagreed with this verbal deficit perspective found that though some students, such as African American students, displayed verbal differences, these were in no way deficits. The elaborated and systematic linguistic properties of Black English, documented by linguists, help to support this notion and to begin to discredit the verbal deficit perspective. Children with cultural and linguistic differences come to school with their own rich language. For educators, the issue lies in bridging the gap between the home language and school language. Although the language itself may be different, cultural differences in how language is used and taught play a significant role. The socialization mismatch hypothesis states that students, quote, are more likely to succeed in school when the home language and literacy socialization patterns are similar to those that are used and valued in school. Beyond just the vocabulary and grammatical rules of language use, there are many cultural differences in how language is used in social situations that may prevent effective communication. Some examples of these are how stories are told, the amount of talk that is directed at preschool children and the participation of young children in conversations with adults. Young children with different socialization patterns than those in school may become confused or withdrawn when teachers speak directly to them. Another example are the opportunities for students to explain events or give their own personal interpretation. Students may need time to both understand this new social context and to develop the language to participate in it. What about the types of questions asked of students during storybook sharing? These can be very confusing, especially when stories are told in a different manner. Lastly, the forms of narrative that are used also need to be explored. Students will need to become familiar with the narratives in which stories are categorized in school, such as fiction, nonfiction, or ongoing narratives. With the recognition that language and cultural differences are not in fact deficits, classrooms have been further studied to examine the educational contexts where students from different cultural and linguistic backgrounds are introduced to and are learning the dominant language and culture. Let's take a look at some of the issues that arise. Educational institutions such as preschools, elementary, middle, or high schools, community colleges, and universities are reflections of society. This includes the policies, programming, curriculum, and assessment of student learning outcomes, along with the interactions that occur in the classroom, office, cafeteria, quad, or on the playground. The power to create school policy, programs, curricula, and assessment, and the power over interactions in the physical spaces of these institutions is largely held by the dominant group in society. Thus, the goals of education are therefore primarily defined by this dominant group. This can and has resulted in discrimination against culturally and linguistically diverse students. Examples of this imbalance of power are ability grouping. Many schools group English language learners by level, robbing them of experiences and peer role models that may be beneficial to their learning. The use of culturally and linguistically biased IQ tests that place students in low achieving groups. It's interesting to note that when the IQ test was developed, it was intended to be a diagnostic tool that was to measure a student's starting point. Students were always meant to improve their IQ after further education. But in more recent history, IQ tests have been used as a summative evaluation to justify placing students in special education, gifted education, or other ability groups. There is also an absence of professionals in schools that are capable of communicating with students who come from different cultural or linguistic backgrounds, along with their families, and contributes to them being marginalized. Marginalized populations are exactly what they sound like. They're pushed into the margins or they're pushed off to the side. They're not focused on and often ignored either indirectly or directly, whether in the classroom or in the larger context of the institution. In the United States, the majority of curricula reflects the experiences and values of middle-class standard English-speaking students. Students that come from diverse populations are often underserved, and their rich culture is often not acknowledged or valued by the curriculum. There are obvious power differences in the broader context that affect educational contexts, such as policies and curricula, but discrimination also lies in the more intimate interactions that occur between an educator and her students on a daily basis. These encounters are referred to as micro-interactions. Micro-interactions between educators, students, and communities form an interpersonal or an interactional space where an individual's identity is formed along with the acquisition of knowledge. Power is created and shared during these interactions where minds and identities meet. Cummins stated that, quote, the micro-interactions constitute the most immediate determinant of student academic success or failure. In other words, these micro-interactions or daily interactions that educators have with the educational community, whether it's students, parents, or other stakeholders, have a powerful impact on a student's ability to be academically successful. These interactions are never neutral, however, and they can be experienced as either coercive or collaborative. In coercive relations of power, the power is largely maintained by the educator, and oftentimes the culture and language of the minority student is developed either directly or indirectly, creating a disempowerment of culturally diverse students. In collaborative relations of power, the power is shared and both languages and cultures are given value. This contributes to the process of empowerment for culturally diverse students and therefore challenges coercive power structures. Educational psychologists now know that learning and motivation are inextricably tied. If a student's identity through their language and culture is constantly devalued and or ignored, how do you think this would affect their motivation? Without motivation to learn, what happens to academic performance? A lowered academic performance may validate an educator or scientist who believes that different cultures or languages are deficient. And you can see how this becomes a pattern. In more recent years, different perspectives and strategies have been developed to support students in developing plurilingualism. Plurilingualism is the ability to speak and interact in social situations in more than one language. Linguists often refer to this as code switching. The quote below about code switching is from The Economist and states, "Many of us subtly, reflexively change the way we express ourselves all the time. We're hopscotching between different cultural and linguistic spaces and different parts of our own identities, sometimes within a single interaction." The global village, whether in the classroom or online, opens up a vase of plurilingual possibility. With the increasing 21st century portability of digital devices, human communication is being transformed into plurilingual communities online. In addition, within the classroom of early childhood learners, learning is demonstrated in a variety of languages alongside English. This strategy of creating a third space allows students to bridge the gap between their home culture and school culture, as well as giving value to them as individuals in the classroom. This third space of learning is an inclusive linguistic and cultural expression of project-based learning, rather than a didactic expression of a monolinguistic approach to learning. The use of collaborative projects that are culturally diverse and plurilingual in the classroom begin to form the basis of and contribute to a process of empowerment for the diverse student. Click on the link on the PowerPoint to see an example of a third space project in an elementary classroom. Finally, as you are learning this week, reflect on these questions. What are your thoughts about how culturally diverse students experience learning in a dominant culture classroom? What has been your own experience in a diverse classroom? What about in a non-diverse classroom? What micro-interactions have either validated or devalued your identity? How did these affect your motivation to learn? How would you implement a third space for student learning in higher education or college classrooms? Don't forget to take Quiz 6 via Blackboard.